quick word before we begin. I have wanted to do this one for a long time, and I kept putting it off because every time I worked it through, I found that saving Cedric Diggory does not make the story kinder. It makes it heavier. So here is the version I finally believe in. Settle in. This is a long one. Amos Diggory was not watching the maze. That is the part he could never forgive himself for afterwards. He was watching the sky above the maze, because that was where the sparks would come from, and he had spent the last 40 minutes telling the man beside him exactly what color those sparks would be. Red for surrender. Red meant a champion had given up and wanted to be collected. Amos had explained the rule 3 times to a witch from the Department of Magical Games and Sports who already knew it. He could not help himself. He was a man with one son and a very loud voice. And tonight, the two things had joined together into something close to unbearable. The stands were full. The hedges of the maze stood 20 feet high and perfectly still, lit along their tops by lanterns, and every few minutes the crowd made a sound like water moving because somebody thought they had seen something. Nothing could be seen. That was the design of the task. 4 champions had walked into the dark an hour ago, and the whole world had been left outside it, guessing. "He is taking his time," said Amos. "That is good. That is Cedric. He does not rush. His mother says he thinks a thing to death before he does it." Beside him, his wife did not answer. She had her hands in her lap and her eyes on the entrance to the maze, and she had not spoken for a quarter of an hour. Then, the air at the mouth of the maze tore open with a crack like a branch breaking, and something heavy hit the grass, and the crowd screamed. Amos was over the barrier before he knew he had moved. He was 46 years old and not a fast man, but he crossed that grass ahead of the judges, ahead of the teachers, ahead of Professor Dumbledore himself, because he had already seen the shape on the ground, and he had already understood one thing about it, and his whole body had gone cold with the understanding. There was one boy on the grass. Harry Potter was lying on his side, with the Triwizard Cup still gripped in one hand, and his other hand was closed on nothing at all. Closed so hard, the knuckles had gone white, as though he had been holding something a second ago and it had been taken. His face was cut. His leg was bleeding. He was making a noise that was not quite a word, over and over, and Amos Diggory, kneeling on the wet grass with the lantern light swinging above him, finally heard what the noise was. It was his son's name. "Where is he?" said Amos. "Boy, look at me. Where is Cedric?" Harry's eyes were open, and they were not seeing the field. They were seeing something else, somewhere else, and whatever it was had emptied him out. "I could not get to him," Harry said. "I tried. He was behind the tomb and I could not get to him." And the noise of the crowd came down over both of them like a wave, and behind it, thin and far away, Amos could hear the voice of Cornelius Fudge asking somebody to please keep the students in the stands. That is where our timeline splits, not in a great flash of magic, in a hand closed on nothing. So let us go back 90 seconds and stand in the graveyard and watch the smallest accident in the history of this war. The cup had dropped them in long grass between the headstones. Little Hangleton lay below in the dark, a scatter of windows, and above them on the hill stood a big empty house with no lights in it. Harry did not know the name of the place, neither did Cedric. They only knew that the maze had ended somewhere it should not have ended, and that the silence around them was the wrong kind of silence. "This was not part of it," Cedric said. He had his wand up already. He had lifted it before Harry thought of it, which tells you most of what you need to know about Cedric Diggory. "Harry, behind me. Something is coming up the path." The figure came out of the yew shadows, carrying a bundle in its arms, the way you carry a baby, and it was short, and it walked as though the bundle weighed more than a man. Harry's scar chose that moment to open like a wound. The pain took his knees out from under him. His wand went into the grass. He was blind and deaf and folded over himself, and somewhere above him, a voice that was high and cold and did not belong to any living throat gave an order. "Kill the other one," it said. Cedric Diggory did the bravest thing he ever did in his life, and it was also the stupidest, and it took him about half a second. He stepped forward. He put himself between Harry Potter and the thing on the path, because he was 17 years old and a Hufflepuff, and he had been raised by a loud man who believed in decency, and there was a boy on the ground who could not stand up. And as he stepped, his heel came down on the corner of a grave slab that had been sinking into the earth for 110 years. The stone tipped. Cedric's leg went sideways into a hole full of old rain. He fell hard, twisting, his shoulder hitting the base of a headstone, and the green light went over him so close that he felt his hair lift. And it struck the yew tree behind and blew a hole in the trunk the size of a dinner plate. Wormtail stood on the path, holding a wand that was not his own, and he began to shake. I want to be honest with you about what just happened, because the whole of this timeline rests on it, and it deserves no dressing up. Cedric Diggory did not survive because he was clever, or because he was quick, or because he was better than the boy who died in the other version of this night. He survived because a stonemason in the 1880s set a slab on soft ground. That is all. That is the entire difference, and I promise you that Cedric worked this out for himself within about a week, and that it did more damage to him than anything else in this story. What followed was a standoff, and it was a short one. Cedric came up on one knee with his wand out and shouted a stunning spell, and it caught Wormtail high on the shoulder and spun him half around, and the bundle in his arms let out a sound of pure fury. Cedric could have run then. The cup was lying 6 feet from his hand in the grass, still glowing faintly, and it would have taken him back to the maze and the lights, and his father in the stands. He did not run. He tried for Harry instead, and Wormtail, who was not a duelist and never had been, did the only thing he was ever any good at. He got behind the hostage. He put the tip of the borrowed wand against the back of Harry Potter's neck, and he screamed at Cedric to drop his own wand, or he would do it right now, this second. And his voice was so high and frightened that Cedric believed every word of it. "Do not," said Cedric. "Do not. I am putting it down. Look, I am putting it down." He put his wand in the grass. Then something came out of the dark between the graves, low and enormous, 12 feet of muscle moving through the grass in a slow curve. And Cedric Diggory backed up against a stone angel with his empty hands raised, and the snake put itself between him and everything in the world he might have reached. I am not going to walk you slowly through what happened next, because you know what happened next, and because it is not the part of the night that changed. The great stone cauldron was already boiling. Wormtail bound Harry to the headstone of a man named Tom Riddle and gagged him. He took a bone from the grave at Harry's feet. He gave up his own right hand, and he took blood from the crook of Harry's arm with a silver knife, and that blood went into the cauldron. And I want you to remember it, because it means everything later. Voldemort's new body carried Harry Potter's blood in it. It always did, in every version of this story. That does not change tonight. What changed tonight was that when Lord Voldemort stepped out of the steam and stretched his long white fingers and turned his red eyes on the graveyard, there were 2 boys in it. He looked at Cedric for a long time. Cedric was flat against the angel with the snake's head at the level of his chest, and he was shaking so hard he could hear his own teeth. Voldemort took Cedric's wand out of the grass with a lazy flick, examined it, and snapped it between 2 fingers as easily as a dry twig. "Wormtail," he said, "you missed." Wormtail made a noise on the ground. "You will not be forgiven for it, but you will be interested to know that you may have done me a service." Voldemort turned the broken halves of the wand over. "Amos Diggory's boy. I know the father, a committee man, a shouter of opinions in corridors." He smiled, and it was worse than the anger had been. "Bind him. Do it properly. I do not want him dead." And then he called his Death Eaters, and they came out of the night in their masks. And this next part is where our story earns its shape, so listen closely. Voldemort's plan for this evening had two halves. The first half was his body, and he had it. The second half was silence. He did not want a war announced in the morning papers. He wanted a year of quiet, a year of gathering, a year in which the Ministry of Magic sat comfortably in its offices and told itself that nothing had happened. He said as much to the circle of masked men and women around the cauldron, and Cedric Diggory, tied at the wrists and ankles behind a tomb 30 feet away, with a silencing charm on him, heard every single word. That was the first thing Cedric understood in that graveyard. He was not a prisoner. He was a mistake. And Lord Voldemort did not keep mistakes. The second thing he understood came a few minutes later, and it was worse. Because the duel happened. Voldemort untied Harry and gave him his wand back and bowed to him, because Voldemort had waited 14 years and wanted it done in front of an audience. And Harry, who was 14 years old and had a broken leg and no plan at all, did the only thing left to him, which was to refuse to die politely. The two wands met. The gold light came up out of nowhere and made a cage over the graves, and the Death Eaters fell back, and the pure high sound rose up that neither boy would ever be able to describe afterwards. I will explain what was happening, briefly, because it matters enormously. Those two wands were brothers. The cause of both came from the tail of the same phoenix. Brother wands cannot properly fight each other. Forced to try, one of them will vomit up its own past, and the shapes of the last people it killed will come out of the tip and stand between the two duelists. Cedric, tied and silent behind the tomb, could see the light. He could see the shapes begin to form. And Harry, on the other side of the golden cage, with his arm shaking from wrist to shoulder, watched the first shape come out of Voldemort's wand and felt something happen in his chest that he could not name for another 2 hours. It was an old man, a thin, bewildered old man in a dressing gown, who looked around at the graveyard as though he had lost something, and who said, in a Yorkshire voice, that whatever this was, the boy should keep hold of it. Harry did not know him. Harry had never seen him in his life, but Harry knew who was not there. The echoes came out one after another, a young woman with a round, pleasant, confused face, who peered at Harry as though trying to place him, and then two shapes that walked out of the wand together and came to stand on either side of him, and they were tall, and one of them had his own untidy hair, and one of them had his eyes. "Let go when we tell you," said his father's shape. "Not before. We can hold him, but not for long." "There is a boy behind the tomb," said his mother's shape. "Tied, alive. Do you see him?" Harry saw him. Cedric had got himself half upright against the stone and was staring at the golden cage with his mouth working uselessly behind the silencing charm. And he was 30 feet away, and there were 9 Death Eaters between them. "Get him," Harry said. "I am not leaving without him." "Then be quick," said his father. Harry broke the connection. The golden cage tore. The shapes of the dead rushed outward like a wind, and for 4 full seconds the graveyard was chaos, and Harry Potter used those 4 seconds to do something that has kept me awake more than once. He tried to summon a person. He pointed his wand at the tomb, and he shouted the summoning charm at his fellow champion, because he was 14 and panicking, and it was the only word in his head, and nothing happened at all. You cannot summon a living thing. A broom will come to your hand across 100 feet of air. A boy will not. Harry did not know that rule until the moment it failed him. He ran instead. He got 9 steps. A curse came past his ear and took a chunk out of a headstone. Another caught him across the ribs and turned him half around. He could see Cedric now, close enough to see his eyes, and Cedric was shaking his head violently and jerking his chin back towards the long grass where the cup lay, and Harry understood him perfectly. Go. Go now. Then Lucius Malfoy stepped over the low wall behind Cedric and put a wand against the boy's temple, and Voldemort's voice came across the graveyard, absolutely calm. Take another step towards him, Harry, and you can carry him home in pieces. Harry took no more steps. He turned, and he dived, and his hand closed on the handle of the Triwizard Cup, and little Hangleton was gone. That is why his hand was closed on nothing when Amos Diggory reached him on the grass at Hogwarts. He had been reaching for a person he could not reach. Now, before we go any further, we need to sit in Professor Dumbledore's office for 10 minutes, because in this timeline, that conversation does something it never got to do in the version you know. It was past 2 in the morning. Harry had been given a potion for the pain and a blanket he did not want, and he had told the whole story twice, once badly and once properly. Sirius Black sat on the hearthrug in the shape of a large black dog because the room contained a ministry problem, and Professor Dumbledore stood at the window with his hands behind his back and listened without interrupting once. When Harry finished, Dumbledore asked him a question that nobody else in the castle would have thought to ask. "The shapes from the wand," he said. "Tell me their order again." "An old man first," said Harry, "in a dressing gown, then a young woman, then my mother and father, together." "You are certain of the order." "I am certain." And Professor Dumbledore closed his eyes, and Harry saw the old man's shoulders come down about half an inch, which from Dumbledore was the same as somebody else shouting. "Then he is alive," Dumbledore said. Harry did not understand. "That effect is called priori incantatem," said Dumbledore. "A wand forced against its brother gives up its history backwards, and where that history is a killing, the shape of the person killed comes out of it. Harry, the people who have died by that wand walked out of it tonight, in front of you, in order, the most recent of them first." He turned around. Cedric Diggory was not among them. If Voldemort's wand had killed him, he would have been the first shape you saw before the old man, before anyone. He was not there, not because he was forgotten, because he is not dead. There is a particular kind of silence that happens when a person is handed something they cannot carry. Harry sat in it for a while. "Then we go and get him," he said. "Yes," said Dumbledore. "That is exactly what we do. I want you to understand, before you leave this room, that it may take a great deal longer than you can presently bear." Harry did not understand that either. He would. Downstairs, in a locked office, Barty Crouch Jr. was sitting in a chair with the last of the Veritaserum still in him, having confessed everything. The portkey, the maze, the year he had spent wearing Alistair Moody's face and drinking from a flask. Professor Snape had brewed the truth potion. Professor McGonagall had witnessed the confession. It was, in the language of the law, unassailable. Cornelius Fudge came up the corridor at 2:20 in the morning with a Dementor walking behind him, because he had decided on the way that a mad murderer needed guarding, and the thing got through the door before anybody could stop it. And by the time Professor McGonagall had driven it back into the corridor with her wand shaking in her hand, Barty Crouch Jr. had no soul left in him to tell anybody anything. That part does not change. It happens in the version you know. I mention it because in this timeline it happens too. A ministry that is about to have a very specific and very awkward problem, and the destruction of its only living witness is the beginning of a lie that will run for a year. Here is the problem. In the version you know, Cedric Diggory came back from that graveyard dead, and a dead boy can be explained. Tragic accident in the maze, a misfired spell, a hedge, a blast-ended scroot, terrible business, flowers, a service, a column in the paper, and by September, the world has moved along. You cannot do that with a boy who is not there. Amos Diggory stood in the hospital wing at 3:30 in the morning and asked the Minister for Magic one question, and he asked it in the voice he normally used for corridors. "Where," he said, "is my son's body?" And Cornelius Fudge had no answer, because there was no body, because there was no death, and because a team of his own investigators was at that moment standing around the Tri-Wizard Cup in the middle of the maze, detecting the residue of an unauthorized port key so strong that one of them said out loud that you could still smell it. Fudge could not deny that Cedric Diggory had been taken somewhere. His own department had proved it before breakfast, so he denied the only part he could not survive. You can watch the story assemble itself over the next 4 days, and honestly, it is the most frightening piece of politics in this whole timeline, because nobody sits in a room and invents it. It just grows, the way mold grows out of what everybody involved would prefer to be true. Fact 1. The cup was a port key. Proven. Fact 2. Bartemius Crouch Jr., an escaped Death Eater from the First War, had been inside Hogwarts all year and had placed it. Proven and convenient, because he was now a man with a body and no mind, and a man like that can be blamed for anything and will never contradict you. Fact 3. A 17-year-old boy had been taken by somebody at the other end of that port key. And so, Fact 4, said the Ministry of Magic. By whom? Not by Lord Voldemort. Lord Voldemort was dead, had been dead for 14 years, and the alternative was a war, and Cornelius Fudge had a ministry to run and no appetite whatsoever for a war. But an escaped Death Eater must have had help. There was a man at large in the country, a convicted mass murderer, a known servant of the Dark Lord, who had broken out of Azkaban 2 years earlier and had never been caught. Sirius Black. I want you to feel how neat that is. It explains the port key. It explains the abduction. It gives Amos Diggory somebody to hate that the ministry is already hunting. It gives the newspapers a face for the front page. And it turns the only eyewitness in the world, a 14-year-old boy who had spent the previous summer being told by the entire wizarding press that he was unstable, into something far more useful than a liar. It turned him into a witness whose evidence was unreliable because he was known to be fond of the accused. Harry Potter never got called mad in this timeline. That was the mercy. And it was not a mercy at all. The Daily Prophet did something colder. It printed the fact that Harry Potter had been alone with Cedric Diggory when he vanished, that Harry Potter had come back holding the trophy, and that Harry Potter's account of the evening involved a dead man returning to life. It printed those 3 things next to each other, week after week, and let its readers do the arithmetic themselves. Professor Dumbledore did what he did in every version of this night. He stood up at the leaving feast in front of a hall with black drapes on the walls that nobody knew what to do with, because you cannot hold a funeral for a missing person, and he told the truth. He said that Lord Voldemort had returned to a body 4 nights ago in a graveyard in the north. He said that Cedric Diggory had been taken alive to that graveyard and had not come back, and that everything within the power of the school and of every decent person in the ministry would be turned towards bringing him home. He said that Cedric had had one chance to save himself that night and had spent it on somebody else, and that the students of this school should remember that when they were older and it was their turn to choose. And he said one more thing, which he had not planned, and which cost him a great deal in the months afterwards. "You will hear another story," said Dumbledore. "It will be tidier than mine." Tidy is not the same as true. When the 2 of them disagree, and they will, I ask only that you remember which one of them requires you to do nothing. Cornelius Fudge left the hall before the end of the feast. Amos Diggory did not leave at all. He sat at the staff table where they had put him, in front of 900 children, with his wife's hand in both of his. And he stared at the empty place at the Hufflepuff table, where his son had sat for 6 years, and he was still sitting there at midnight when Professor Sprout came to take him home. He did not go home. He went to his office in the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures at 4 o'clock in the morning, and he began writing letters. Hold on to that. It matters more than anything else in this story. Cedric Diggory woke up on the 25th of June, 1995, on a stone floor in the dark, and decided within about a minute that he was going to count. I have thought about that decision a lot. He had no wand. He had a shoulder that turned out to be cracked, and a knee that had swollen to twice its size in the night. He was somewhere underground, because the air was cold in the way that only underground air is cold in June. He could hear, a long way above him, the sound of somebody's shoes on a wooden floor, and twice, a woman's voice complaining about something in a tone that told him she was not a prisoner. He could have spent that first hour screaming. Plenty of people would have. Instead, Cedric Diggory found a loose flake of stone at the base of the wall and scratched one short line into the mortar at the height of his knee, and said the number out loud because he had worked out something important while he lay there in the dark. If he did not know how long he had been in this room, then somebody else got to decide how long he had been in it. And Cedric had a strong suspicion, based on the last thing he had heard Lord Voldemort say in that graveyard, that lying to him was going to be the whole point of whatever came next. So, Day 1. The Daily Prophet, meanwhile, began its own count on the 24th, the night of the task, and printed it in a small black box at the top of the front page. Day 1, Day 2, Day 9, Day 30. Their number and Cedric's number were never the same. The paper was printed the night before it landed, so its box was always one day behind him. He was ahead of the whole world by a day, every day, all the way to the end, and he never once found that funny. The room he was in was under Malfoy Manor. He did not learn that for 11 days, and when he learned it, it was because a boy came down the steps with a plate. Draco Malfoy was 15 years old that summer. He had turned 15 3 weeks before the third task, and he had spent the whole of that year telling anybody who would listen that his father knew things. And now his father knew a thing that Draco could not look at without feeling sick, and it was sitting on the floor of his own cellar with a cracked shoulder. Nobody had told him to bring the plate. That is the part I find interesting. There was a house elf for that. Draco came down anyway 3 or 4 times that summer, always at odd hours, always with the same closed white face, and he never once said anything that could be described as kind. "You look worse than yesterday," he said the first time. "I am aware," said Cedric. "You should not have come out from behind that stone. In the graveyard, my father said you came out from behind the stone on purpose." "Your father was there then." Draco went very still, and Cedric watched him understand exactly what he had just handed over and watched him decide not to take it back. And that was the moment Cedric Diggory started running a war of his own down there. Because Cedric had nothing. No wand, no door, no daylight. What he had was a 15-year-old boy who came down the stairs when nobody had asked him to, and a mouth, and a great deal of time. He was not going to escape. He worked that out early, and he did not waste his strength on it. He decided instead to become expensive. He decided to be a thing that cost the people upstairs something to keep. "Does your mother know I am down here?" he asked in the second week. Draco did not come back for 9 days. Up in the world above, that summer went quiet in the worst possible way. Harry Potter went back to number 4, Privet Drive, on the 1st of July, and the protection built out of his mother's death closed over that house again, and inside it, he was as safe as any boy in Britain and completely useless. He wrote to Sirius. He wrote to Ron. He wrote to Hermione. He got back short letters that said nothing over and over, because everybody who wrote to him was terrified of owls being intercepted, and because the honest answer to his only question was one that nobody wanted to put on paper. His only question was, "Have you found him?" The honest answer was, "We know he is alive, and we do not know where he is, and we cannot say either of those things out loud." Let us be exact about what the Order of the Phoenix knew that summer, because a lot of people get this wrong, and then the whole year stops making sense. Professor Dumbledore reformed the Order within a week. 12. Grimmauld Place, the ancestral house of the Black family, became its headquarters because Sirius Black owned it and could not leave it. And into that house, in the middle of July, came Severus Snape, who had gone back to Lord Voldemort on the night of the third task, and had somehow persuaded him that his 14 years of teaching at Hogwarts had been a long game played on Dumbledore's behalf. Snape brought them one piece of information about Cedric Diggory, and only one. "He is alive," he said. "He is being held. He's not at the Riddle House, and he is not anywhere. I have been taken." "Then find out where," said Sirius. "There are perhaps 4 people who know," said Snape. "I am not one of them. The Dark Lord has decided that the location of the Diggory boy is a matter for the family that is keeping him and for nobody else. If I begin asking, I will be the man who asks. Do you understand what happens then? Not to me, to him. The instant the Dark Lord suspects that anyone in this house knows the boy is alive and where, the boy stops being useful, and a boy who is not useful is a body in a ditch by morning." Nobody in that kitchen liked it. Molly Weasley put her hands over her face. Sirius said something that I'm not going to repeat, and Remus Lupin, who was 3 days off a full moon and looked grey with it, put a hand on his shoulder and said nothing at all. And Professor Dumbledore, at the head of the table, made a decision. He decided that they would not move on Cedric Diggory until they could move on him with certainty, because a failed rescue killed him, and a discovered spy killed everything. I am going to defend that decision once, and then let you hate it for the rest of this story, which is exactly what everybody in the Order did. Dumbledore was right about the mechanics. He was right that a raid on a wrong house in July would have ended with a dead boy in a ditch and a dead spy in a cupboard. He was also making the same mistake he always made, which is that he decided it alone, and he did not tell the 2 people who would have burned the world down over it, and one of those people was Amos Diggory and the other was Harry. That silence is the wound in this timeline. Everything that goes wrong later comes out of it. Now, the Dementors. On the 2nd of August, 1995, 2 Dementors came down Magnolia Crescent in Little Whinging in the dark and cornered Harry Potter and his cousin Dudley in an underpass. And Harry drove them off with a Patronus, and the Ministry of Magic sent him a letter of expulsion within 20 minutes. That happens in the story, you know, and it happens here, and the reason is the same. Dolores Umbridge, Senior Undersecretary to the Minister for Magic, sent them. In the version you know she sent them because Harry was telling a story about Voldemort that had to be silenced. In this version she sent them for a reason that had a bit more ministry logic in it and was therefore far more dangerous. She sent them because on the 28th of July, the Wizengamot's Department of Magical Law Enforcement had quietly concluded that there was no case against Harry Potter over the disappearance of Cedric Diggory. That conclusion is worth its own minute, because it is the closest thing to a fair hearing anybody gets all year. Madame Amelia Bones ran that review. She had the boy's wand examined by a ministry specialist who forced out of it, spell by spell, every incantation it had cast in the maze and afterwards. Disarming charms, a shield charm, a stunning spell, the 4-point spell, a summoning charm, cast at nothing, at the very end. No curse of any kind that could have harmed a human being. Madame Bones read the report, put it down, and said the sentence that shaped the entire year. "We have no case," she said. "That is not the same as no crime. Somebody took that child. Until we know who, I will not have this office pretending the question is closed." And in the corridor afterwards, Dolores Umbridge understood 2 things at once. She understood that the boy could not be prosecuted, and she understood that the boy was therefore going to go back to Hogwarts in September and keep talking, in a castle run by Albus Dumbledore, to 800 children whose parents voted. 6 days later, there were Dementors in Little Whinging. The hearing was on the 12th of August. In an old courtroom 10 floors under London, and it was meant to be a formality that expelled a boy on a technicality. Fudge convened the full Wizengamot. Dumbledore arrived at the last second, having walked in from a meeting nobody could name. Mrs. Arabella Figg gave evidence about Dementors in an underpass, and did it badly and honestly. Madam Bones asked one clean question about whether a 15-year-old could produce a corporeal Patronus, and then answered it herself by asking Harry to do it in the courtroom, in front of everybody. And Harry did. And a silver stag walked the length of that chamber and turned every head in the room. Harry had turned 15 12 days earlier. I mention his age because the newspapers spent the year forgetting it. He was cleared of the charge by a majority. Fudge did not look at him. And then, as the benches began to empty, a man stood up in the public gallery. Nobody had noticed Amos Diggory come in. He had a ministry pass and a right to be there, and he had been sitting in the dark at the back for 2 hours with his hat in his hands. "Minister," he said, "you have had that boy in front of you under oath for 2 hours. In all that time, not one of you asked him about my son." The chamber went completely silent. Not one question. 2 hours. Amos's voice did the thing it always did when he was in a corridor, and filled the whole space. He is the last person to see Cedric. He is the only person who has seen the place they took him to. He has been sitting there, available, answering questions about a Patronus charm in a tunnel. He was shaking. Ask him. Somebody ask him. Ask him what he saw. Fudge said something about the appropriate department and an ongoing investigation. "I am the appropriate department," said Amos Diggory. "I have read the investigation. 9 pages. 9 pages in 7 weeks, Minister, and 4 of them are about a trophy." 2 wizards from the Department of Magical Law Enforcement began moving up the gallery steps towards him, politely, the way you move towards a man who is embarrassing everybody. And Harry Potter, still standing in the chain chair in the middle of the floor, called out across the courtroom to a man he had spoken to twice in his life. "Mr. Diggory, he stood in front of me. He did not have to. He stood in front of me, and that is the only reason I'm alive." Amos Diggory looked down at him for a long moment. "I know," he said. "I have read your statement. I have read it about 400 times." And then, quietly, in a courtroom of 100 people, the most important sentence of this entire timeline. "I believe you, son. That is my trouble. I am the only man in this building who is not allowed to." The 1st of September, 1995, was day 69 on the wall of the cellar, and day 68 in the black box on the front page of the Daily Prophet, because a newspaper is set the night before it is read. The Hogwarts Express was a strange train that morning. There is a particular silence that a school makes when one of its own has been taken. And it is not the silence of grief, because grief has an end you can walk towards. It is the silence of a corridor full of people all doing sums in their heads. Harry Potter got his own compartment before he had even sat down in it. Not out of respect. I want to spend some time on this, because it is the part of this timeline that people underestimate, and it is far crueler than the version you know. In the story you know, Harry spends his 5th year being called a liar and an attention seeker. It is horrible, and it isolates him, but it also has a shape he can push against. Here, nobody called him a liar. The Prophet had been far cleverer than that. For 9 weeks, it had run a small black number on the front page and a photograph of a smiling 17-year-old under it. And beside them, at least once a week, a photograph of a 15-year-old boy with a scar walking out of a courtroom. Cleared. Cleared. That was the word they used over and over, and they used it because it does 2 jobs at once. It means innocent. It also means somebody looked, So the students on that train were not hostile, they were worse. They were curious, and they were careful, and they got quiet when he walked past, and a third-year girl from Ravenclaw stood up in a doorway to watch him go by and forgot to pretend he was doing anything else. Hufflepuff House was not careful. Hufflepuff House was at war. They had lost a boy who had been their captain, their champion, and the single most decent person in that castle. And they had lost him inside a competition where the last thing anybody saw was him and Harry Potter walking into a maze together. And in 10 weeks, the Ministry of Magic had told them precisely nothing, and into that silence went 800 rumors. Zacharias Smith found Harry on the second day in the entrance hall, with about 40 people watching. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Straight out, not going behind your back about it." "Go on," said Harry. "When you touched that cup, whose idea was it that you touch it at the same time?" Harry did not answer because the answer was that it had been his own idea, and because there were 40 people listening, and because he had asked himself that question every night for 10 weeks and had not got a single night's sleep out of it. "Right," said Zacharias Smith. "That will do," said Ernie Macmillan, who had come up behind him and who spent the whole of that year being the most exhausting kind of fair-minded. The Wizengamot reviewed it. Madam Bones herself. "There is no case." "I know there is no case," said Zacharias. "I'm not saying there is a case. I am asking whose idea it was." Hannah Abbott was crying quietly at the foot of the marble staircase, and Susan Bones was standing beside her with her arms folded and an expression on her face that said she had heard rather more at home over the summer than she was allowed to repeat. And Cho Chang, who was 16 years old and in her 6th year and who had known Cedric Diggory since she was 11, said one sentence from the top of the stairs that shut the entrance hall up completely. "Cedric would hate this," she said. "All of it. Every one of you." Cho ran a list that year. She started it in the first week of term, in the back of a charms notebook, and she put down every single thing anybody knew for certain about the night of the third task, and she left the rest blank. It was 2 pages long by Christmas, and most of it was white space. She was not doing it out of hope. She was doing it because a person who has been taken becomes a story very quickly, and Cho Chang had decided that somebody in that castle was going to keep hold of the facts. She never asked Harry a single question about the graveyard, not once, all year. I have thought about why, and the best I can manage is that she had worked out that if she started asking, she would not be able to stop. Then, on the 3rd of September, Hogwarts got a new teacher of defense against the dark arts. Dolores Umbridge was appointed by the Ministry of Magic and announced her purpose at the welcoming feast in a voice like sugar left in the sun. Progress, preservation, the pruning of practices that ought to be prohibited. The hall stopped listening after 2 minutes. Apart from Hermione Granger, who did not stop listening at all and who came out of that feast white in the face. In the timeline, Umbridge is at Hogwarts to make sure nobody teaches the children to fight because the ministry is frightened that Dumbledore is building an army. In this timeline, she has that job and a second one, and the second one is a great deal more personal. She has been sent to produce a confession, not a false one. This is the detail that makes her genuinely frightening here, and I want to be fair to her, in the way you are fair to a wasp. Dolores Umbridge did not believe that Harry Potter had murdered Cedric Diggory. She believed something more comfortable and, in her own mind, more useful. She believed that a 15-year-old boy had done something stupid in a maze, that a criminal had used it, that the boy had panicked and invented a monster to hide behind, and that the entire crisis facing the Ministry of Magic could be dissolved by one sheet of parchment in that boy's handwriting saying so. Her first lesson was a reading lesson. Wands Away. Chapter 1. Harry lasted 11 minutes. "There is nothing out there worth being taught to fight," said Umbridge, "and I am aware of the rumor to the contrary. It is a rumor spread by a very small number of very unhappy people." "Cedric Diggory is not a rumor," said Harry. The class stopped breathing. "Cedric Diggory," said Umbridge, "is the victim of a dangerous criminal. Sirius Black is a rumor spread by nobody at all. He is a fact. He is at large, and he did not require anybody's return from the dead to do what he did. Sirius Black has never been within 100 miles of Cedric Diggory." "And how, dear, would you know that?" There it was. She had been in the castle for one day, and she had already set the trap she intended to keep him in all year, and Harry Potter walked straight into it because he was 15 and because it was the truth. "Because I was there," he said. "I saw who took him. It was not Sirius Black, and the man who gave the order had a face like a snake, and he came out of a cauldron, and there were 9 Death Eaters standing around him in masks, and one of them was Lucius Malfoy. He got detention until further notice. You know what the detentions were? He was made to write a line with a black quill that had no ink in it, because the ink came out of the back of his own hand. I must not tell lies. She chose that line in the version you know, and she chose it here, and here it means something slightly different, and worse. She was not trying to make him stop saying that Voldemort was back. She was trying to make him stop saying the second half of it. Because as long as Harry Potter insisted that a living, breathing, walking Lord Voldemort had ordered Cedric Diggory taken, the Ministry could not solve the Diggory problem. And Dolores Umbridge had been sent to Hogwarts to solve it. Harry never wrote a single line that admitted anything. He sat in that pink office one evening a week from September to December, and he wrote the same 6 words until his hand would not close. And then he went up to Gryffindor Tower and put it in a bowl of Murtlap essence that Hermione had brewed, and he did not tell anybody for nearly a month. Ron found out first because Ron slept 4 feet away and Ron was not stupid. I need to talk about Ron Weasley now, and I need to do it properly. Because in a story with a missing boy and a grieving father and a snake-faced villain, it would be very easy to let Ron become furniture. And this year, he is anything but. Ron was made a prefect in September. He got the badge in the post at the Burrow and he wore it wrong for the first 3 days. He also got the Gryffindor keeper position after a trial that he very nearly lost, and he was bad at it for 2 months in front of the entire school, and he kept turning up. But the thing Ron Weasley did that mattered in this timeline was smaller than either of those. Ron kept a note of Draco Malfoy. It started as spite in the 2nd week of term. Malfoy had said something about the Diggorys at the Slytherin table, loudly, and Ron had wanted to hit him and had settled for hating him accurately instead. And over about 6 weeks, Ron began to notice that Draco Malfoy, who had spent 4 years unable to walk past Harry Potter without opening his mouth, had stopped mentioning Cedric Diggory entirely. Malfoy would insult Harry's broom, his hair, his mother, his money, the Weasleys, Hermione's parents, and Hagrid. He would not touch the one subject that the whole school was chewing on, and that would have cut deepest of all. He's avoiding it, Ron said, in the common room in the middle of October, with his charms essay unwritten in front of him. Harry, he's not being polite. Malfoy has never been polite in his life. He's avoiding it. He's avoiding it because his father was in that graveyard, said Hermione. No, said Ron. That would make him worse, not quieter. If your dad was in on it and you thought you were on the winning side, you would be unbearable. He looked up. He's quiet because he knows something he's not allowed to say. Hermione opened her mouth to argue and then closed it again, which happened to Hermione Granger about 4 times a year. That was the 14th of October, 1995. Day 112. It took them another 5 months to do anything with it, and by then it was almost too late, and I want you to remember whose idea it was, because nobody in that room wrote it down. Meanwhile, 3 floors up and about a week later, Harry had a conversation that changed how he thought about the whole thing, and it was with Ginny Weasley. He had been sitting in a window on the 4th floor at 1 in the morning because he could not sleep, and Ginny had come past on her way back from somewhere she should not have been, and had sat down on the ledge opposite him without asking. You keep doing the same face, she said. I know that face. What is it tonight? I keep thinking about whether he is still himself, said Harry. He had not said it to anybody. Dumbledore says he is alive. Fine. He has been in a room with them for 120 days. Voldemort does not keep people to be nice to them. What comes back? Ginny Weasley was 14 years old. She was in her 4th year. 3 years earlier, she had spent 11 months writing in a diary that wrote back and had come out of a chamber under the school having done things she could not remember doing. He will be himself, she said, and he will not believe he is. Those are two different things, and nobody tells you that. Harry looked at her. When it was me, said Ginny, the worst part was not what he made me do. It was afterwards, when I could not work out which of my own thoughts were mine. I used to test myself. I would decide to do a thing and then check whether I actually wanted to. She pulled her sleeves down over her hands. If Cedric Diggory is alive in a room somewhere, he is doing that. Every day, he's checking. And he will get it right, nearly every time. And the few times he does not, he is going to remember those for the rest of his life. So how do you help someone like that? You get them out, said Ginny. And then you believe them when they tell you what happened. The first time they tell you, without making them prove it. She stood up. Nobody did that for me for about a year. You were 11, so I am not counting you. She went off up the corridor. That is the conversation Harry Potter thought about at the Department of Mysteries. 8 months later, with a boy's arm over his shoulders, and the whole room falling apart around them. The Defense Association had its first meeting in the back room of a pub in Hogsmeade in the middle of October, and 28 people came, which was 3 more than in the version you know. The 3 extra were all Hufflepuffs. Hermione Granger had called the meeting, and she had prepared for it, the way Hermione prepared for everything, and she lost control of it inside 4 minutes because Zacharias Smith stood up before she had finished her second sentence. I want to know what we are actually here for, he said. Are we here to learn to duel, or are we here to listen to Potter's story again? You are here, said Hermione, because in June we are all sitting an examination in defense against the dark arts, and the woman teaching it has not let us take our wands out since the 3rd of September. That is not why you called it. No, said Hermione. Too far, it is not. And that, oddly, is what won them. Hermione Granger stood in the back room of the Hog's Head and told 28 people the entire truth, in order, including the parts that made Harry look worse. She said that Harry Potter had touched the cup at the same moment as Cedric Diggory because he had refused to win the tournament alone. She said that this decision had put Cedric in that graveyard and that Harry knew it and would know it for the rest of his life. She said that Cedric Diggory had chosen to stand in front of a 14-year-old and had then chosen not to run when he could have, and that both of those choices were his own and nobody in this room got to take them off him. Then she said that everything else about that night came from Harry and could not be proved by anybody, and that they were all going to have to decide for themselves. So you want us to take it on trust, said Zacharias Smith. I want you to take it on evidence, said Hermione. There is not enough. So yes, for the moment, trust. She put her list down on the table. Sign it or do not. It makes no difference to the lessons. 25 people signed that day. Zacharias Smith signed too, at the very end, and made an enormous performance of saying that he was only signing because he intended to be there when the story fell apart. He came to every single meeting, everyone, all year, including the ones on freezing Tuesdays after Quidditch practice, and he complained the entire time, and he was one of the 4 best duelists in that room by March. I will come back to him. They met in a room on the 7th floor that appears when you need it, and Harry Potter taught them. And if you have not thought about how strange that is, think about it now. A 15-year-old boy stood in front of his classmates twice a week and taught them disarming, stunning, impediment jinxes, shield charms, and the beginnings of the Patronus charm, because the alternative was sitting still. Neville Longbottom learned faster than anybody in that room. And he learned faster because of something he said in November, quiet, to Harry, while everybody else was packing up. "They took my parents," Neville said, "in 81. Both of them, out of their own house. Everybody talks about the ones who died. Nobody knows what to say about the ones who came back wrong, so they say nothing at all." He rolled his sleeves down. "Your friend is somewhere right now, so I would like to be able to do more than say nothing." Neville Longbottom was 15 years old. His parents were in the long-term ward at St. Mungo's Hospital and had been since before he could walk, and he had told exactly 2 people in 5 years. Now, the cellar. Day 101, early October 1995. Cedric Diggory turned 18 underground. He knew the date because he had counted, and he was right, and nobody said anything about it, and it was the day he stopped being a child in the eyes of wizarding law without a single person in the world marking it. What was happening to him down there was not what you are probably imagining, and I'm going to be careful here, because the point of this story is not cruelty for its own sake. They did not need to hurt him much, they needed him to say things. The plan was simple, and it was Voldemort's own, and it was, I am afraid, extremely good. He had a living witness to the night of the third task, and the entire wizarding world was arguing about what had happened that night, and one of the 2 boys who had been there was in his cellar. Sooner or later, at the moment of his choosing, Lord Voldemort intended to produce Cedric Diggory, alive, rescued apparently from a shed somewhere, half-starved, in front of the newspapers. And the boy was going to say that Sirius Black had taken him on the orders of Albus Dumbledore, and that Harry Potter had known. Think about what that does. It does not just discredit Harry. It takes the one thing keeping the Ministry from doing something even stupider, which is Dumbledore's reputation, and it burns it in public using the mouth of the most well-liked boy in Britain. So the work in the cellar was rehearsal. They used the Imperious Curse, not constantly, because a person held under it for months goes hollow and starts to look wrong, and a hollow boy is no good in front of the newspapers. They used it in sessions, and in between the sessions, they left him alone in the dark to think about the fact that he had said the words, because he did say them. I am not going to pretend otherwise, and neither did he, ever, afterwards. Under the Imperious Curse, in that cellar, Cedric Diggory said that Sirius Black had taken him, dozens of times, in a clear, steady voice, and the first time he came out of it and remembered doing so, he was sick on the floor. Then he started fighting it. You can fight it. That is a real limit of that curse, and it matters enormously. Barty Crouch Jr. taught a class of 14-year-olds to throw off the Imperious Curse while wearing another man's face, and Harry Potter learned to do it in about 3 lessons. And the trick is not strength. The trick is having something of your own in your head that you are holding on to that is more specific than the instruction. Cedric held on to the count. That is what the scratches on the wall were for, in the end. Not the calendar. When the curse came down on him and the world went soft and warm and simple, and a voice told him what he had seen in the graveyard, the number was there underneath it, hard and stupid, and his, 106, 107. And he would go looking for it, and sometimes he found it. And on the days he found it, he said nothing at all. By November, he was throwing it off perhaps 1 time in 5. By February, it was better than half, and they knew it. And that was when they became careful with him in a completely different way. Do you understand the trouble he had made for himself? A boy who can resist the Imperious Curse is useless to that plan, because you cannot put him in front of a newspaper and risk him saying whatever he likes. Cedric Diggory made himself unusable on purpose. He knew exactly what that meant. He worked out sometime around Christmas, in a cellar, with a broken flake of stone in his hand, that the safest way to be was useful. And he threw it away deliberately, because the alternative was standing in front of his father and saying a sentence that would end Albus Dumbledore. That is the bravest thing anybody does in this timeline, and no one in the outside world ever heard about it. Which brings us to Amos. The first letter came on the 22nd of October. It arrived at the Diggory house at 4 in the morning without an owl. It was simply on the kitchen table when Amos came down, and the back door was locked, and the wards on that house had been laid by a ministry man who took them seriously. The letter was 3 lines long, and it was in Cedric's handwriting. It said that he was alive. It said the name of the pony Amos had bought him when he was 6, which had been called Dumpling, a fact known to precisely 4 people on Earth. And it said, in a hand that pressed too hard on the paper, that Amos was not to tell anybody at all, ever. Underneath, in a different hand, entirely without threat or greeting, was a request. The Department of Mysteries kept a duty roster. Amos Diggory did not work there and could not get into it, but Amos Diggory had worked in the Ministry of Magic for 24 years. And he ate lunch with a man from Magical Maintenance who knew which corridors were staffed at which hours, because he was the one who lit them. Amos Diggory sat at his kitchen table until 7:30 in the morning, and then went to work and had lunch with his friend and asked him some ordinary questions about lamps. I am not going to tell you that he was wrong. I am going to tell you what it cost over the next 8 months, and then you can decide, and I suspect you will find that you cannot. He was not the first person they tried. They had tried the direct route in the summer. Sturgis Podmore, a member of the Order of the Phoenix, was found at 1 in the morning in August, in front of a door in the Department of Mysteries, with no memory of how he came to be there, having been put under the imperious curse by Lucius Malfoy, and he went to Azkaban for 6 months for it, and never understood why. In October, they tried an unspeakable called Broderick Bode, who actually worked in that department and could get through the door. And Bode reached the shelf and put his hands on what he had been sent for, and whatever protection was on it broke his mind on the spot. He was carried out of the ministry babbling and went into a bed on the long-term ward at St. Mungo's. 3 beds from Frank and Alice Longbottom. 2 imperious curses. 2 failures. And Lord Voldemort learned from both of them the single most useful thing he learned that year, which was that the object he wanted could not be lifted from that shelf by anybody except the people it was about. That left him needing Harry Potter to walk into the Department of Mysteries and pick it up. And by the end of October 1995, he had 2 ways to make that happen. He had a 15-year-old boy on the other end of a scar, whose dreams he was already learning to walk into. And he had a father in an office in the ministry doing small favors involving lamps. On the night of the 18th of December, Harry Potter dreamed that he was a snake in a dark corridor, and that a red-haired man was sitting on the floor outside a door, and that he struck him twice. He woke up shouting, and Professor McGonagall got him to Dumbledore's office in under 3 minutes, and Arthur Weasley was found in the Department of Mysteries in time to save his life, which was not the case in a great many other timelines. Arthur had been guarding that door since August. That was his order duty. And it was the reason Sturgis Podmore had been arrested, and it was the reason a snake came down that corridor in December, and it very nearly killed him. He spent Christmas at St. Mungo's Hospital with wounds that would not close because they had been made by a snake carrying a piece of Lord Voldemort inside it. I bring this up for 2 reasons. The first is that it is the moment Harry Potter begins to understand that the connection in his head runs both ways, which becomes everything in June. The second reason is a corridor on the 4th floor of St. Mungo's and a conversation that nobody planned. The Weasleys went to visit Arthur on Christmas Day, and Harry and Hermione went with them, and on the way out they got lost, which is very easy in that hospital, and they ended up in the long-term ward. There were 4 people in it who mattered. There was a wizard in a bed at the end who had lost his memory entirely, and who cheerfully offered to sign his name for them, and who had once been their teacher. There was Broderick Bode, sitting up, saying nothing, with a potted plant on his bedside cabinet that had been sent in by a well-wisher and that nobody had looked at very closely. He was strangling to death on it inside 3 weeks, on the 22nd of January. It was Devil's Snare. Hermione worked out what it had been the moment she read the notice in the paper, and she cried in the library, once, quickly, and then wrote it on a list of her own. And there were Frank and Alice Longbottom and their son, who had come with his grandmother on Christmas Day, the way he came every Christmas Day, and who had not told his friends he was going to be there. Neville went scarlet. Then he decided something and stood his ground and introduced them, and his mother came shuffling over and pressed an empty sweet wrapper into his hand, and Neville said thank you and put it in his pocket with all the others. And Amos Diggory was in that ward too. He was 2 beds along, sitting in a chair he had brought in from the corridor next to nobody at all. He had got into the habit that autumn of going to the long-term ward on his way home from the ministry because it was the only place in Britain full of people whose families were also waiting for somebody to come back, and because there was nowhere else he was allowed to sit and say his son's name out loud. He looked up and saw Harry Potter standing in the doorway of the long-term ward on Christmas Day. They did not speak for a while. "Day 183, said Amos. 184, said Harry. Amos Diggory blinked at him. "The paper is a day behind," Harry said. "They set that box the night before, so the number is always yesterday's. I do it properly. First morning is day 1. He was extremely embarrassed. "It is stupid." "No," said Amos. "No, that is right. That is right. That is how you do it." And he put his hand over his mouth for a second, and then he stood up and shook Harry's hand very hard and did not let go of it. And Augusta Longbottom looked away out of politeness, and Neville did not, because Neville had understood something. "Mr. Diggory," said Neville, "do they tell you anything? The ministry? Do they come and tell you things?" "They send me a letter every fortnight," said Amos. "It says the investigation continues." "Ours said that too," said Neville, "for about 3 years. Then they stopped sending it." Amos Diggory looked at that boy, 15 years old, standing between 2 people who did not know his name, and something went across the man's face that I do not think he ever recovered from. He had spent 6 months telling himself that the thing he was doing at the ministry was temporary, that it was small, that it was lamps and rosters and lunches, and that he would stop the moment his son was home. And a boy in a hospital ward had just shown him what 14 years of waiting looks like from the inside. He went home that night and wrote out on ministry parchment the name and the shift pattern of every witch and wizard who had worked the 9th level of the Ministry of Magic in the past 3 months. He left it on his own kitchen table at 4 in the morning, and in the morning it was gone. That was the second delivery. There were 5 in all. I am telling you about them in order because the order matters at the end. The first, the duty roster of the corridor, October. The second, the staff and shift patterns of the 9th level, Christmas. The third came in February, and it was the worst of the 3, and I will get to it. Meanwhile, 10 days into January, Azkaban happened. 10 Death Eaters walked out of that fortress in a single night because the Dementors that had guarded it for centuries had decided that they preferred the other side, and the Ministry of Magic announced that the breakout had been organized by Sirius Black. Fudge had no choice. He had spent 19 months telling the country that Black was the most dangerous man in Britain, and 7 months telling them that Black had taken Cedric Diggory. And now that same convenient bogeyman had to carry the biggest prison break in wizarding history as well. The story was groaning under the weight, and it was in that week, for the first time, that the story started to crack in public, and the crack came from an unexpected place. Because Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, read the list of the 10 who had escaped and noticed, out loud, in a meeting, that Sirius Black had not been in Azkaban when 9 of those 10 went in, had never met 4 of them, and was the cousin of the woman who had led them out. "You are asking me," she said, to believe that a man who spent 12 years in that place for serving the Dark Lord broke his own cousin out of it, and also stole a schoolboy, and also, presumably, arranged the portkey, and that he did all of this alone while sleeping rough with no wand that we have ever recovered. Minister, I am not a credulous woman. Then what do you propose? Said Fudge. I propose that we stop deciding what happened and start finding out, said Madame Bones. She was overruled, but she began, quietly, from that January, keeping her own file, and she gave 2 of her aurors one instruction that nobody ever signed off. They were to find out whether anybody at all could place Sirius Black within 50 miles of Little Hangleton on the 24th of June. They never could. That is the answer, and she had it by April, and it is the reason a great many people were still alive at the end of June. Out of Azkaban that January came Bellatrix Lestrange, and within a fortnight, Lord Voldemort had given her a job. She was put in charge of the Diggory boy. Now, up to this point, the cellar had been Wormtail's responsibility, and Wormtail was a coward with a silver hand who talked too much and left things where they could be reached. Bellatrix Lestrange was not a coward and did not talk too much, and the first thing she did was stop the sessions altogether for 3 weeks and leave Cedric completely alone in the dark, because she had read the notes and she had understood immediately what everybody else had missed. The boy was winning. They have been asking you for a sentence, she told him, at the end of the 3 weeks. That was always foolish. You are not a mouth. You are a hook. Cedric did not know what she meant. Your father writes very neatly, said Bellatrix Lestrange, and went back up the stairs. That was the worst day of the 360. He told Harry about it much later, and he said that he had spent the previous 7 months holding on to exactly one thing, which was that whatever happened to him was happening to him alone, and that no matter how bad it got, it was contained in that room, and that his father was upstairs in the world being loud at people in corridors. He said that when she went up the stairs, he understood that he was not a prisoner at all. He was a lever. He stopped counting for a while after that. 11 days. He went back and worked them out afterwards from the meals and put them in, which is why there is a slightly crooked run of scratches on that wall between day 221 and day 232. And in the same fortnight, at Hogwarts, Harry Potter began occlumency lessons with Professor Snape. Occlumency is the art of closing your mind, and Harry Potter was very bad at it. And he was bad at it for a reason that Professor Snape correctly identified in the first lesson and reported to nobody. You cannot close a mind that is looking for something. Harry had spent 7 months with one question in it. Where is he? And that question had made him into exactly the kind of open door that Lord Voldemort had been probing at since the summer. And every lesson in that dungeon made it worse, because every time Snape forced his way in, the memories he came out holding were the same 3 memories, over and over. A graveyard, a tomb, a hand closing on nothing. You are not defending anything, Snape said in February. You are guarding a wound. Wounds cannot be guarded, Potter. They can only be closed, and you have decided not to close it because you have confused the pain with loyalty. He is still in there, said Harry. I'm aware. Harry stopped. That was the first crack. He did not understand what he had heard for another 6 weeks, and when he did understand it, it went off like a bomb. Here is the situation in the spring of 1996, and I want it clear, because 4 separate people were sitting on 4 pieces of the same answer, and none of them would speak to each other. Professor Snape knew Cedric Diggory was alive because he had stood in rooms where Lord Voldemort discussed him. He did not know where. He could not ask. Telling Harry Potter anything at all was out of the question, because Harry Potter's mind was a window that the Dark Lord had learned to look through, and putting information in there was the same as posting it. Professor Dumbledore knew everything Snape knew, and had known it since July and had decided to wait. He was also avoiding Harry Potter completely that year, deliberately, for exactly the same reason. He could not sit in a room with the boy without giving something away through the boy's eyes, and so he did not, and Harry read that as abandonment, and it very nearly cost them everything. Amos Diggory knew his son was alive and knew nothing else, and was buying that knowledge in installments with information out of the Ministry of Magic, and could not tell a living soul because the first line of every letter told him not to. And Draco Malfoy knew where he was. Draco was the loose thread all spring, and the reason is almost sad. He had gone home at Christmas, and the cellar had a different guard in it, and the different guard was his Aunt Bellatrix. And Draco Malfoy discovered over 10 days that he was frightened of somebody in his own family. He came back to school in January quieter than anybody had ever seen him. Ron Weasley noticed. Ron had been watching him since October. He has stopped eating breakfast, Ron reported, in the second week of February, with the air of a man laying down a winning card. In the Great Hall, he gets there, he sits down, he leaves, and he has not said one word about Diggory since September. And Harry. This week Pansy Parkinson said something about the Diggorys at the Slytherin table, and Malfoy got up and walked out. "That is not evidence of anything," said Hermione. "It is evidence that he has a stomach," said Ron, "which is new." The break came on the 28th of February, in a corridor outside the Charms classroom, and it came because Harry Potter finally did something he should have done in October, which was to stop shouting at Draco Malfoy and start listening to him. Malfoy started it as usual, something about Weasleys and money, and Harry, instead of drawing his wand, said 7 words in a perfectly ordinary voice. Is he in a room or a cellar? Draco Malfoy's face did something that Harry Potter remembered for the rest of his life. It emptied. Completely. For about a second and a half there was nothing behind it at all, and then it filled up with pure fright, and Malfoy said the single most useful sentence anybody said to Harry that year. "You have no idea what she does to him. He's not going to be any good to you when he comes out." Then he walked away very fast and did not attend Charms. She, not they, she. Hermione had the whole thing worked out inside 40 minutes, sitting on the floor of the room of requirement with a daily profit from January in front of her, and it was the coldest piece of reasoning I have ever watched a 15-year-old do. Malfoy went home at Christmas and came back chained. 10 Death Eaters left Azkaban in the second week of January, and the prophet had printed all 10 faces. One of those faces was Bellatrix Lestrange, whose sister Narcissa was married to Lucius Malfoy and lived in a house in Wiltshire that had been in the family for 400 years and had cellars underneath it. "He is in Malfoy Manor," said Hermione. "Harry, he has been in Malfoy Manor since June." And this is the part of the story where I have to introduce the one character who could have ended all of this in 10 minutes, because if I do not deal with him honestly, then nothing else in this timeline holds together. House elves. A house elf can go where a wizard cannot. They travel by their own magic, in and out of houses that are sealed against everything else, and they do it silently. And there was a free house elf living in the kitchens at Hogwarts who had spent the first 12 years of his life serving the Malfoy family and knew every room in that building. Dobby volunteered before Harry finished the sentence. He was on his feet on a table saying yes, about 4 words in. They planned it for 3 days. They planned it properly. Dobby was to go in, find the cellar, take hold of the boy, and come straight out to a field 2 miles from Hogsmeade, where Harry, Ron, Hermione, Ginny, and Neville would be waiting under the invisibility cloak with a port key that Fred and George had obtained by means that nobody wanted described. Dobby went in at 2 o'clock in the morning on the 4th of March. He came back 9 seconds later into the middle of that field, and he was on fire along one side, and he could not stand up, and he had nobody with him. Lord Voldemort had not forgotten house elves. He had used one, years before, for something he cared about a great deal, and it had taught him precisely what they could do. The cellars of Malfoy Manor had been sealed against elf magic since the second week of July, before Cedric Diggory had even learned where he was, and the seal was not a door that Dobby had failed to open. It was a trap that had been sitting there for 8 months waiting for exactly this. Dobby lived. Hermione Granger and Madame Pomfrey between them kept him alive for 4 days, and he was walking again by the end of the month. And for the rest of that year, he wore 9 hats at once, because Harry had once said he looked cold. But the plan failed, and it failed loudly, and it cost more than a burned elf. Kreacher had heard them. The old black family house elf had been at Grimmauld Place all year, hating everybody in it, forbidden to leave, and Kreacher was bound to the House of Black by magic older than any of them, and the last true daughter of that house, in his opinion, was Narcissa Malfoy. In the version of this story, Kreacher slips out and tells the Malfoys that Sirius loves Harry Potter more than anything in the world, and that single piece of gossip kills Sirius Black in June. Here, Kreacher had something better to tell them. He told them that Harry Potter's friends had sent an elf into the Wiltshire house looking for the Diggory boy, which meant Lord Voldemort knew, within a day, that somebody on Dumbledore's side of this war knew his hostage was alive and roughly where. Cedric was moved on the 7th of March. He never learned where to. There were no more scratches on the wall of that cellar after day 256, because the new place had a floor of packed earth and he had to start keeping the count in his head, and he was very frightened of losing it, and he did lose 4 days somewhere in April. And they are wrong in his account forever, and Severus Snape was called to a meeting on the 9th of March, at which Lord Voldemort talked for 2 hours about who inside his own circle could have let the location up. He came back from that meeting and cancelled the occlumency lessons, and he did not tell Harry why. The lessons ended in the way they ended, with a pensive on a desk and a boy who could not leave it alone. Snape was called away mid-lesson, and Harry Potter looked into the stone basin, and he came out of it 2 minutes later having seen 2 things. The first was a memory of a 15-year-old Severus Snape being hung upside down in the air beside a lake by a laughing boy with untidy black hair who looked exactly like Harry. The second was a memory of a much older Snape standing in Professor Dumbledore's office with rain on the windows, and it was summer in the memory, and Snape was saying that the Diggory boy was alive. And Albus Dumbledore was saying, in a voice Harry had never heard him use, that they would do nothing. Nothing, Snape repeated. Nothing that can be seen. We will look, Severus. We will look very hard in every direction, and we will find nothing, and we will go on finding nothing, and when we are certain, we will move once. And the father? The father must not be told, nor the boy. He will hate you for that. Yes, said Dumbledore, he will. Harry Potter came out of that pensive and stood in the middle of Snape's office and did not move for a long time. I want to be careful about what he learned, because it was not the truth. He learned a fragment, out of context, with the worst possible reading available and no adult in the building willing to give him the rest. He learned that his father had been cruel, which was true. And he learned that Albus Dumbledore had known Cedric Diggory was alive since July and had chosen, out loud, on purpose, to leave him where he was, and had specifically ordered that Amos Diggory be lied to. He did not learn why. He had 8 facts, and one of them was that Dumbledore had spent the entire year refusing to look at him. Snape came back and found him standing there and threw him out of the office and out of the lessons and screamed at him about his father. And Harry did not argue about his father at all, which frightened Snape more than shouting would have. Harry went to the fire in Umbridge's office at 1 in the morning with a bag of flu powder he had no right to have, and he put his head in it, and he asked Sirius Black one question. Did you know? And Sirius Black, who had spent 9 months in the house he hated most in the world, and who loved that boy more than he had ever loved anything, and who could not lie to him, said yes. Since July, said Sirius. Harry, listen to me. You let his dad think he was dead? We did not let him think anything. We were not allowed to tell him. You sat in that kitchen at Christmas. I was there. Amos Diggory was in a hospital corridor on Christmas Day next to Neville's mum, because it was the only place he could say his son's name out loud, and you knew. There was a silence in that green fire that went on for about 6 seconds. "I have been arguing with Albus about it since the second week of August," said Sirius very quietly. "I have lost every single time. He's right about the mechanics, Harry. That is the thing that makes it unbearable. If we go in on a guess and he's not there, they kill him. If we go in on Snape's word and they trace it back, they kill him and they kill Snape and we lose the war." He stopped. "And every morning I get up in this house and I think about a boy in a room and I think, we did this to somebody before. 12 years and nobody came, because everybody sensible had a reason not to look at it. Harry, I am done being sensible." That was the 12th of April, 1996. 67 days before the Department of Mysteries. Remember it. Sirius Black made a decision in a fireplace 2 months before he died, and he made it about somebody else's godson. The Defense Association was discovered 9 days later. It was betrayed by a 6th-year girl called Marietta Edgecombe, whose mother worked in the Flu Network office at the Ministry of Magic, and whose family could not afford for her to be caught in a room learning to fight. She went to Dolores Umbridge, and she paid for it immediately because Hermione Granger had jinxed that sign-up list back in October, and nobody had thought to mention it, and Marietta Edgecombe wore the word sneak across her face in purple boils for months. I have never been comfortable with that, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. She was 16 and frightened, and her mother's job was on the line, and she was punished harder and longer than anybody else in this story who actually deserved it. Umbridge got to the room with the list in her hand, and Albus Dumbledore did what he had presumably been planning to do since October. He told the Minister for Magic, in his own office, in front of witnesses, that the organization had been his, that the students had joined at his instruction, and that Harry Potter had known nothing about it. It was a straight lie told to save a boy from Azkaban, and it worked, and Dumbledore left the castle rather than be arrested. Dolores Umbridge became headmistress of Hogwarts on the 22nd of April, 1996. She had Harry Potter brought to her office the next morning, and she gave him a cup of tea. I love this scene. It is the only genuinely funny thing that happens in this entire timeline, and it is funny in a way that would make your blood run cold. She had gone to Professor Snape at the beginning of April and requisitioned a file of Veritaserum, in writing, on a proper ministry form, because Dolores Umbridge was a woman who believed in paperwork. Snape had given her a file of clear liquid and had watched her sign for it. It was water. There was a very small amount of Wideye potion in it, so that the drinker's pupils would do something interesting, because Severus Snape had a sense of humor that could take the paint off a wall. So Harry Potter sat in a pink office in front of a woman holding a quill and drank a cup of tea, and Umbridge asked him where Cedric Diggory was. And Harry, who had understood what was happening the instant she watched him swallow, sat back in the chair and told her the entire truth in a slow, dreamy, cooperative voice. He told her about the portkey. He told her about a bundle carried like a baby and a cauldron in a graveyard in Little Hangleton. He told her that Cedric had stepped in front of him and about a stone that had shifted under his heel, and he told her the names of the 9 Death Eaters he had recognized in that circle. And the first name he gave her was Lucius Malfoy, and the second was Bellatrix Lestrange, which was interesting, because in April of 1996, Bellatrix Lestrange had been officially at large for 3 months, and unofficially a ministry embarrassment for longer. He told her that Cedric Diggory was alive, that he had been held in a cellar in Wiltshire for 8 months, and that he had been moved on the 7th of March. Dolores Umbridge wrote none of it down. She sat there with her quill in her hand, and her face went from pink to a sort of grey, and at the end she asked him one more question, and it is the most honest question she asks in her whole life. "Who else has said this to you?" "Nobody," said Harry. "I was there." She poured the rest of the tea into a plant. And that is the moment, I think, that Dolores Umbridge stopped believing the Ministry story and decided to keep telling it anyway, which is a different and much smaller kind of evil than the one she had started the year with. She had a document in front of her, obtained under what she believed to be truth serum, that would have destroyed Cornelius Fudge in a week. She burned her own notes that evening. 10 days later, Fred and George Weasley set off a portable swamp on the 5th floor and left Hogwarts on broomsticks in front of the entire school, which is one of the 4 or 5 happiest things that happens all year. And they left because they had a shop to open, and they had the money for it because Harry Potter had given them 1,000 galleons in July. He had tried to give it to the Diggorys first. That is worth 30 seconds. The Ministry had awarded him the Triwizard winnings in the 2nd week of July, quietly, by owl, because a tournament with an unresolved champion is an administrative nightmare, and Cornelius Fudge wanted the file closed. Harry had written to Amos Diggory the same afternoon and asked him to take it. Amos wrote back 4 words, "I do not need it." He explained himself much later, and what he said was this: if he took that money, he was taking a settlement. And a settlement is a thing that happens at the end of something. So Harry gave it to Fred and George and said, when they refused it twice, that he wanted at least one thing in the world to be funny. Then came the 3rd delivery, and everything ended. On the 19th of May, 1996, Amos Diggory found a 4th letter on his kitchen table, and it was not in Cedric's handwriting. It contained one instruction. He was to make sure that the 9th level of the Ministry of Magic was unstaffed on the evening of the 18th of June, and he was to be there himself at 8 o'clock, and he was to bring nothing and nobody. And it said that if he did those things, his son would be in that corridor, and he could take him home. Amos Diggory sat with that letter for 26 days. He knew. I want that on record, because it would be very easy to make him a fool. And he was not a fool. He was a ministry man of 24 years who had spent 8 months feeding information into the dark. And he understood exactly what he had been building, piece by piece, and what the last piece was for. They did not want him. They wanted the level empty and a Diggory in the corridor. And there was only one person in Britain who would walk into a room to fetch Cedric Diggory without asking a single question first. The letter was not asking Amos to collect his son. It was asking him to be the bait for a 15-year-old boy. On the 14th of June, he went to Arthur Weasley's house. I would give a great deal to have been outside that kitchen window. Arthur Weasley, 4 months out of St. Mungo's, with the scars of a snake bite still not properly healed on his chest, sat at his own table and listened to a man he had known for 20 years explain that he had spent the year handing the layout of the Department of Mysteries to Lord Voldemort in exchange for a pony's name on a piece of paper. Molly Weasley did not throw him out of the house. She put the kettle on, which was worse, and she sat down and held Amos Diggory's hand while he shook. "How much have you given them?" said Arthur. "Rosters, names, shifts, where the lamps are, which doors are watched." Amos could barely get it out. "Arthur, a snake came down that corridor in December because of me. I knew it the moment I heard. I have been to your bedside. I sat by your bed in that hospital and held your hand, and I knew." "Yes," said Arthur Weasley. "You did." Then he stood up and put on his coat and said the only useful thing available, which was that they had 4 days, and that Albus Dumbledore was in hiding somewhere in the country and would have to be found tonight. They found him. And on the 15th of June, in a room over a shop in Diagon Alley, the Order of the Phoenix finally had all 4 pieces of the answer on one table at the same time. And Albus Dumbledore did something that he had refused to do for 11 months. He decided to move, not on Malfoy Manor, not on a guess. On the 18th of June, at 8 o'clock in the evening, on the 9th level of the Ministry of Magic, where Lord Voldemort had promised to deliver Cedric Diggory in person, and where 6 members of the Order of the Phoenix were going to be waiting in a corridor that the enemy believed would be empty. They had one problem, and it was the boy. The whole trap depended on Harry Potter arriving. If Harry did not come, Voldemort would smell the room and vanish, and Cedric would go with him. If Harry did come, he came straight into the middle of it. "Then we tell him," said Sirius. "We tell him everything. We bring him in, and he walks into that corridor with all of us around him." "He is at Hogwarts," said Professor Dumbledore, "and the fireplaces are watched by Dolores Umbridge, and if I appear in that castle I am arrested within the hour. Severus cannot be seen to pass him a message, and the Dark Lord has spent 9 months learning the inside of that boy's head." He looked round the table. "If we place this plan in Harry's mind, we place it in Voldemort's." Which is how it came about that on the 18th of June, 1996, the Order of the Phoenix went to the Department of Mysteries to spring a trap. And the only person in the world who did not know they were doing it was Harry Potter. He was sitting an examination. The ordinary wizarding level examination in the history of magic ran from 2 o'clock until 4, and Harry Potter had finished writing about goblin rebellions when he put his head on his arms, and Lord Voldemort walked into his mind and showed him a corridor. It was black, and it was long, and there were torches burning in brackets, and at the far end of it, a door stood open, and there was a boy sitting on the floor against the wall, with his hands tied in front of him and his head hanging down, and he was 18 years old and thin as a stick, and his hair had grown down past his collar, and when the vision moved closer he lifted his head, and it was Cedric Diggory. Somebody in the vision said, "This one has learned to be stubborn." Somebody else said, "Then leave him there and bring the other." That was all. It lasted perhaps 20 seconds, and it was almost entirely true, which is what made it work. Because the last vision Lord Voldemort had shown that boy through that scar had been true as well. Harry Potter came up out of that examination hall with his scar on fire and one thought in his head, and there is not a person alive who would have had a different one. He was in that room, sitting up, alive, looking at me. What happened next went wrong in 4 different ways in under 90 minutes, and I am going to take them in order because every single one of them mattered. The first thing Harry did was right. He went to check. Hermione made him, and it is the best thing she does all year. She stood in the corridor outside the examination hall and refused to move until he had put his head in a fire and confirmed that the vision was true, because she had spent the whole year watching him be walked into by something that lived in his scar. So they broke into the headmistress's office and used her fireplace, and Harry called Grimmauld Place, and what he got was Creature. The old elf came out of the shadows of that kitchen, absolutely delighted, and told Harry Potter, with enormous pleasure, that the master of the house was not there. "Where is he?" "Master has gone to the Ministry of Magic," said Creature, and he was smiling, and his eyes were bright, and he was telling the exact truth. Master went at 7 o'clock with the werewolf and the others. Master would not say why to Creature. Creature told the mistress's family everything he knows, as is proper, and Creature knows nothing about a corridor. Oh no. The second thing that happened was that Dolores Umbridge came through the door with 6 members of her inquisitorial squad, and Draco Malfoy was one of them, and the situation in that office turned into something out of a nightmare in about 4 seconds. Umbridge had Harry Potter held in a chair, and she had run out of paperwork. "You will tell me who you were speaking to," she said, "and then you will tell me where Albus Dumbledore is, and I am past caring how." She raised her wand, and she said the beginning of a word that she had no legal right to say to a child. And Hermione Granger heard her say it, and Hermione's improvisation, from that point on, was the fastest thinking anybody did that day. She told Umbridge, in a rush of tears, that Dumbledore had left a weapon hidden in the Forbidden Forest. They went into the trees, all three of them. I will keep this short because it is not the heart of the night. There was no weapon. There was a colony of centaurs who had spent the year being spoken to by Dolores Umbridge as though they were livestock. And there was a very short conversation. And then there was not a headmistress of Hogwarts anymore. She was carried off into the deep forest, and she was found 2 days later, and she never taught again, and she never told anybody what happened in there. The third thing that happened was that Draco Malfoy, standing in the entrance hall at 6:30 in the evening, with a bruise coming up on his cheekbone from where Ginny Weasley had hit him, with a bat bogey hex, watched 6 people go out of the front doors of the castle towards the forest and did not raise the alarm. He told his father afterwards that they had overpowered him. His father believed it. Draco Malfoy never told anybody ever in his whole life that he had stood in that hall for 90 seconds with a working wand in his hand and had thought about a cellar in his own house and had put the wand in his pocket. 6 of them flew to London. Harry, Ron, Hermione, Ginny, Neville and Luna on the backs of thestrals, which are winged horses that can only be seen by a person who has watched somebody die. Harry Potter could not see them. I want to stop on that for a moment because it is the quietest thing in this entire story, and it nearly made me put my quill down. In the version of this night that Harry Potter walks into that clearing and sees the thestrals perfectly well because he watched a boy die in a graveyard 11 months earlier and he has not stopped seeing it since. Here, he walked into the same clearing and there was nothing in it but empty air and the sound of something chewing. Luna Lovegood could see them. Luna's mother had died in front of her when she was 9. So it was Luna Lovegood who took them across that clearing that evening, putting each of their hands one at a time onto a neck they could not see, telling them where the wings were. Neville Longbottom climbed onto the back of nothing at all because a 15-year-old girl told him it was there. Hermione Granger did it with her eyes shut and her jaw set. And Harry, sitting on empty air 100 feet above the Forbidden Forest, worked out for himself why he could not see the animal underneath him and understood that he was about to fly to London to keep it that way. They came down in a telephone box on a scruffy street in London at 20 to 8 in the evening, and they went down in a lift, and the doors opened onto the 9th level of the Ministry of Magic. The corridor was black and long, and there were torches burning in brackets. The door at the end stood open. It was exactly what the vision had shown, but there was no boy sitting against the wall. "He was here," said Harry. "He was right here." And the fourth thing went wrong, which was that Harry Potter had come to the 9th level 15 minutes early, and the Order of the Phoenix was still upstairs. They went through the black door because there was nothing else to do. They went through the round room with the 12 doors that spins when you close it, and they tried 3 of them. And behind the third one was a room the size of a cathedral, full of shelves that went up out of the light. And on the shelves were rows and rows of small dusty glass spheres. Row 97. There was a sphere on that shelf with 2 names on the yellowed label, and one of the names was his own. I want to be very clear about how this trap worked, because it is the same trap as the one in the story, and it is built out of a completely different material. In that other version, Lord Voldemort has no hostage, so he manufactures one. He puts a false picture in Harry's head of Sirius Black being tortured in this room, and Harry comes for a man who is safely at home in a kitchen. Here, he had a real one. He did not need to invent a single thing, and that is why nothing in Harry's mind pushed back. He had shown the boy a true picture of a true prisoner in a true corridor. He had arranged for Amos Diggory to empty the level, and what he wanted was on a shelf that could only be lifted by the person named on the label. "Take it down, Potter," said Lucius Malfoy from the shadows at the end of the row. You will find you cannot pass it to anybody, so you will hand it to me yourself. There were 11 of them. They came out from behind the shelves on both sides, in masks and hoods, and the children put their backs together in the middle of the aisle, and Bellatrix Lestrange laughed somewhere up on the left in the dark. And then 2 Death Eaters walked Cedric Diggory into the aisle and stood him up where Harry could see him. He was 18. He was so thin that his own school jumper, which somebody had thought to put back on him for effect, hung off his shoulders. He had a year of hair and a year of beard, and there was a chain on his wrists. He looked at Harry Potter across about 20 feet of stone floor, and he did the single most Cedric Diggory thing that anybody has ever done. He shook his head. "Do not give it to them," he said. His voice was a wreck. "Harry, whatever it is, do not." "Shut him up," said Lucius Malfoy. "You are not going to kill me," said Cedric to Malfoy, quite reasonably, as though they were discussing a Quidditch fixture. "You have had 360 days to kill me. You need me to say something in front of a newspaper, and I am not going to, and you have known that since February." He turned back to Harry. 360. Tell my dad the number. He will know what it means." Harry Potter stood in that aisle with a prophecy in his hand and a decision to make, and I have thought about this moment for a very long time, and I do not know what I would have done. He did not have to decide, because at that moment every door in that room came open at once. 6 people came into the Hall of Prophecy. Sirius Black, Remus Lupin, Nymphadora Tonks, Kingsley Shacklebolt, Alastor Moody, and Amos Diggory, who was not a duelist, who was a 47-year-old committee man from the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, and who came through that door first. The Hall of Prophecy came apart, shelves fell into shelves, and thousands of glass spheres broke on the floor. And the ghostly shapes of the people who had made those prophecies rose out of the wreckage, speaking all at once in 100 voices, so that the whole fight took place inside a fog of muttering ghosts. Neville Longbottom broke a Death Eater's wand arm. Ginny Weasley took 2 of them off their feet. Luna Lovegood, of all people, was the calmest person in the room. Hermione was hit by something silent and dark in the chest, and went down, and Ron Weasley stood over her and would not move, and he was still standing over her when it finished. The prophecy was smashed in the first 30 seconds. Nobody knows who did it. It fell out of Harry's hand when he was knocked sideways, and it broke under somebody's boot, and the small voice that came out of it said its 50 words to nobody in a room where 200 other voices were saying theirs. Lord Voldemort never learned what the prophecy said, not in this timeline either. Amos Diggory got to his son. He came down that aisle, through the falling glass with his wand out in front of him, like a man holding a lamp. And he had no skill whatsoever, and it did not matter, because there is nothing in the world quite as dangerous as an ordinary man crossing a room to a person he has been counting days for. He put a shield charm between the 2 Death Eaters and his boy, and he held it while it buckled. He got the chain off his son's wrists. He got him behind a fallen shelf. He never said anything to him. He did not have a single word available. He put both hands on the sides of Cedric's head and looked at him, and then went straight back into the fight, because his son could not stand up, and somebody had to hold the gap. They fell back through the doors, and into the room with the sunken stone floor, and the raised dais in the middle of it. And on the dais stood a stone archway with a ragged black curtain hanging in it that moved as though there were a wind behind it, and there was no wind. You know what that archway is. Harry Potter had Cedric Diggory's arm over his shoulders and was taking his weight, and Cedric could not run, and had not walked more than 9 feet in a straight line since March, and the 2 of them went down those stone steps far too slowly, with curses going over their heads. Sirius Black bought them the time. He came in beside them laughing, which is the thing everybody remembers, and he drove Bellatrix Lestrange back up the steps and away from the two boys on the floor. And he was enjoying it, and he called her something rude about the family, and for about 15 seconds, Sirius Black was as happy as he had been at any point in the last 15 years. "Go!" he shouted at Harry. "Get him up the stairs. Do not stop." Harry stopped. That is the whole thing. That is the entire point of this story. And it took me a long time to see it, because in the graveyard, 11 months and 25 days earlier, Harry Potter had 1 second to choose between a boy he could not reach and his own survival. And he chose to live, and it had eaten him alive for a year. And here he was again, on a stone floor with the same boy, and this time he had hold of him, and this time he was not letting go for anything in the world. So when the second jet of red light came out of Bellatrix Lestrange's wand, Harry Potter was looking the wrong way. He was looking down at Cedric. He was pulling Cedric's arm further over his shoulders and getting his feet under him. He did not see Sirius get hit. He heard it. By the time he looked up, his godfather was falling backwards through the black curtain in the stone archway, and his face was still surprised. And then he was not there anymore, and the curtain moved slightly as though a wind had come through it and settled. Remus Lupin caught Harry before he got 2 steps up the dais and held him and told him the truth, which is that there was nothing behind it and nobody comes back. He was still holding him when the doors banged open at the top of the room and Albus Dumbledore came in. And Harry Potter, sitting on the stone steps of that dais, with a shaking 18-year-old boy propped against his shoulder, understood what he had just paid and what he had just been given, and that he had not been allowed to choose between them. The rest of it happened above their heads. Bellatrix Lestrange ran, and Harry Potter went after her, and there was a duel in the atrium of the Ministry of Magic between Albus Dumbledore and Lord Voldemort that broke the fountain, cracked the floor, and set fire to the security desk. At the end of it, Voldemort could not win, and knew it, and did the one thing left, which was to go inside Harry Potter's head and sit there and invite Dumbledore to kill the boy in order to reach him. He could not stay. What drove him out was not a spell. It was that Harry Potter was, at that moment, thinking about Sirius Black, and grief of that kind is unbearable to a man who has spent 70 years making himself incapable of it. Voldemort left, and Cornelius Fudge, Minister for Magic, arrived in his own atrium about 9 seconds too late to see him, with 8 officials behind him at the exact moment that the golden fountain finished collapsing. Now, in the version of this story, Fudge sees Voldemort with his own eyes for half a second before he disapparates, and that half second ends his denial. In this one, he missed it. He arrived 9 seconds late, and if that had been all, I honestly believe Cornelius Fudge would have found a way to explain the wreckage of his own atrium as a Dumbledore problem. Because a man will explain almost anything, rather than admit he has spent a year being wrong on the front page of a newspaper. Instead, he came down the marble steps into that ruin and found, sitting on the edge of the broken fountain with a blanket round his shoulders, wearing a Hogwarts jumper 4 sizes too big for him, a boy that the Ministry of Magic had spent 360 days not looking for. Cedric Diggory looked up at the Minister for Magic. "Hello, Minister," he said. "You will want to sit down." He talked for 4 hours. He talked in that atrium while the Aurors were still binding Lucius Malfoy, and then he talked in an office, and then he talked in front of Madame Amelia Bones, who took his statement herself with her own quill and did not delegate one line of it. He named 9 people who had stood in a circle around a cauldron in a graveyard in Little Hangleton on the 24th of June, 1995. He named the 4 who had come down to the cellar. He described the room, the ward on it, the smell of it, the number of steps. He gave the date he had been moved, and he gave the reason, which was an elf. And he said more than once that Sirius Black had never been in that graveyard, had never been in that cellar, had never been anywhere near it. and that he had been made to say otherwise under the imperious curse in a room in Wiltshire dozens of times over 10 months, and that he had fought it, and that he had not always won. He also said, on the record, in his first statement, without being asked, that Harry Potter had tried to come back for him in that graveyard and had been stopped at one point. He insisted that it be written down in those words. He made Madame Bones read it back to him. The Daily Prophet's black box on the front page ended on day 359, which was wrong by one, and nobody ever corrected it. Sirius Black was cleared 11 days later by a ministry that had killed him with a story, and the letter of exoneration was addressed to his next of kin. And his next of kin was Harry Potter, who put it in a drawer and did not read it again for years. Cornelius Fudge resigned within the month. And on the 26th of June, 1996, two Aurors came to a house in Somerset and arrested Amos Diggory in his own front garden. He had told them himself. That is what almost nobody outside that courtroom ever understood. There was no investigation that found Amos Diggory out. He had walked into Arthur Weasley's kitchen 4 days before the Department of Mysteries and confessed to everything. And the first thing he had done in the atrium after they took his son off the fountain was find Madame Bones and repeat all of it standing up. The trial was in September, passing information likely to be of use to an enemy of the ministry, 5 counts. The second count was the one that mattered, because the shift patterns he had handed over at Christmas had put Arthur Weasley in a corridor on a night when a snake came down it. And Arthur Weasley sat in that courtroom, healthy, with his wife on one side of him, and gave evidence for the defense. Cedric Diggory gave evidence too. He had put on about 1.5 stones by September. He had cut his hair. He had spent 2 months at home and 3 weeks in St. Mungo's, and he still could not sleep with the door shut. And he walked into that courtroom and up to the witness chair without any help, which he had insisted on. He did not defend his father. That surprised everybody, including his father. He told the Wizengamot that Amos Diggory had handed over the duty roster of the 9th level in October and the shift patterns in December, and that these were not small things, and that a man had nearly died because of the second one. He said that his father had known exactly what he was buying and exactly what he was paying with. He said that his father had been given 4 letters and had acted on 3 of them. And then he said this. You will want to know why he stopped. I have thought about that more than he has, I think. He stopped at the 4th letter, and the 4th letter was the one that offered him me. They told him I would be in that corridor, and he could take me home, and all he had to do was leave the level empty and stand there and be seen. Cedric looked at the benches. He worked out what he was for. He worked out that the corridor was not for him. It was for a 15-year-old boy who would walk into any room in Britain if my name was in it. And he gave up the only chance he was ever offered to get me back. And he walked into a kitchen in Devon and told the truth to a man he had nearly killed. He stopped for a moment. I'm not asking you to let him off. He did it. I sat in the dark for a year and I did not say one word they wanted. And I want you to understand that I know exactly what it costs to say no to those people. And I know exactly what my father did, and I am not going to stand here and dress it up. His voice did not shake. I am asking you to notice that when they finally offered him the thing he wanted most in the world, he said no. That is all. Notice it, and then do whatever you were going to do. The Wizengamot sent Amos Diggory to Azkaban for 3 years. There were no Dementors in Azkaban by then. They had gone over to the other side in January and never came back. And the fortress was held by Aurors, which meant that for the first time in 300 years, it was a prison where a person could serve a sentence and come out with a mind. Small mercies. It was the only one going. Cedric was allowed to visit once a month. And that is where I want to leave this. In November of 1996, on a boat crossing grey water in the North Sea, with a bag of his mother's fruitcake on his knees. Because there is one last thing you need to know about Cedric Diggory. He never went back to Hogwarts. Professor McGonagall offered him a year and a place to sit his nastily exhausting wizarding test examinations, and he thanked her properly and said no. He was 19 by then, and he had been out of that castle for 2.5 years, and he did not want to be a boy in a jumper being looked at by 800 people. He did go back for one afternoon, in the second week of July, 3 weeks after the Department of Mysteries. He asked Professor Sprout to gather up whatever Hufflepuffs were still in the country, and about 30 of them came. And he sat on a table in the middle of that basement common room and answered every question they had for 3 hours, including the ones about the cellar. Zacharias Smith was there. Cedric got him on his own at the end of it and asked him what he had said to Harry Potter in the entrance hall in September, because Cho Chang had written it down on a list. And Cho Chang gave that list to Cedric, all 2 pages of it, white space and everything, and he read it in one sitting and then sat with it in his hands for a while. Zacharias told him. To his credit, he told him accurately, and he did not soften it. Right, said Cedric. So you asked him whose idea it was that they touched the cup together. He nodded slowly. It was his. He would not take it on his own. He had just watched me get hurt in that maze, and he would not take it on his own. And if he had taken it on his own, I would have finished second in a tournament and gone home in a carriage, and I would have had a lovely year. He looked at Zacharias Smith. You were right about the facts, and you built something horrible out of them. That is a thing you are going to be able to do for the rest of your life. I would think about it. Zacharias Smith did think about it. He turned up at the wrong end of a great many fights in the 2 years after that, and he was not brave, and he came anyway, which I have decided counts. So, November 1996. A boat and grey water. Cedric Diggory had a notebook in his coat pocket, and in the notebook was a number, and the number was going down. He had started it on the day of the sentencing because he had discovered something about himself in that cellar that he did not particularly like and could not get rid of. He could not stop counting. He had done it for 360 days in the dark because it was the only thing in the world that had belonged to him, and it had worked, and it had saved his mind, and now it would not switch off. So he had turned it around. 3 years, minus 1 day, every day, in his own handwriting, for a man in a cell in the North Sea who had counted 360 of them for him first. That is the whole difference. In the end, Cedric Diggory lived, and nothing about it was clean. A boy came home a year late, and a man went to prison. And Sirius Black died anyway, and Harry Potter got his name back in a courtroom, and lost the only family he had in a room 2 floors below it. But there is a common room in a basement at Hogwarts where 30 people got their questions answered, and there is a notebook in a coat pocket on a boat. And in the version of this story where the stone did not shift, none of that exists. Nobody counts. There is a grave in a village in the south of England with a name on it, and the number stops at nothing at all. That is it for this one. If you want the version where Amos Diggory never opens that first letter, tell me, because I have looked at it and it goes somewhere much worse than this. Thanks for staying to the end of a long one.